They were supposed to be crushed in a single day, minus 10,000 starving peasants armed with farm tools, standing against the steel-clad might of the German knights. Yet somehow they toppled them. This is the untold story of how ordinary men, miners, shepherds, and farmers rose up and brought medieval Europe to its knees. It began in 1524, in the heart of the Holy Roman Empire. The land was boiling with hunger and injustice. Lords feasted in stone castles, while the people bled under taxes, famine, and faith twisted into chains. But one voice, a preacher with fire in his eyes, dared to say what no one else would: God does not will this. What followed was not a rebellion. It was a reckoning. They marched beneath banners painted with the cross, but their enemy wore it too. When scythes met swords, when the earth trembled under peasant boots, the world witnessed something unthinkable. But here's the truth no historian tells you. The revolt didn't fail because the peasants were weak. It failed because of something far more human and far more tragic, and that is where our story begins. The spark beneath the empire, the year was 1524, and the Holy Roman Empire stood like a sleeping giant, unaware that the ground beneath it was about to crack. In the valleys of Swabia, winter had stretched into despair. The soil was thin, the harvest gone, and the Lord's taxes came like vultures after famine. Every sunrise brought the same sound, the clang of church bells calling peasants not to prayer, but to labor for men who called themselves chosen by God. Hans Muller, a veteran of old wars, now plowed fields that would never be his. He had fought for the empire once, seen blood spill for kings and bishops, but now his own children starved. And when the Lord's tax writers came again, demanding grain that didn't exist, something inside him snapped. But Hans was not alone. Across the valleys, voices whispered the same truth: this cannot go on. It began with sermons, not swords. In village squares, men gathered under moonlight, listening to fiery preachers who spoke of Scripture not as a chain but as a key. If all men are born under God, one preacher thundered, then why do some feast while others starve? The name that stirred the wind that night was Thomas Munzer, a man once of the church, now its greatest threat. Munzer spoke of a coming storm, God's justice rising through the hands of the poor. His words spread faster than any army could march. In taverns and barns, in whispers and shouts, the people began to believe that heaven itself was on their side, and then one village refused to pay its tithes. The Lord sent soldiers. They never came back. That single defiance, one flickering ember in a frozen land, became the spark that set the empire alight. Soon, whole towns joined. Blacksmiths forged weapons from farming tools. Women sewed banners stitched with the cross and the words, "For God's justice." Messengers rode from hamlet to hamlet, carrying scraps of parchment bearing 12 demands, the 12 articles, calling for freedom from serfdom, fair tithes, and the right to choose their pastors. It wasn't revolution yet. It was desperation given voice, but the nobles laughed. They called it madness. Peasants quoting Scripture and demanding justice. They believed the revolt would burn out in a week. They were wrong, because when spring came and the snow melted from the fields, what rose from the thaw was not submission, it was an army, tens of thousands of peasants, miners, millers, and herdsmen gathered in makeshift camps. Their weapons were crude, flails, scythes, pitchforks, but their hearts burned with something sharper. They sang psalms as they marched, believing every step was watched by angels, and when they reached the first castle, they surrounded it. Inside, knights laughed over wine, until the first flaming cart rolled through the gate. The sky turned red that night. The peasants stormed the walls, not with tactics but with rage. What they lacked in armor, they found in fury. The castle fell before dawn, and as it burned, word spread like wildfire: the peasants have taken the Lord's fortress. Europe gasped. But here's the shocking truth most people never knew. The peasants didn't just destroy the castle. They opened its cellars and found documents, ledgers, proof of taxes so cruel they bordered on theft. For the first time, they saw the machinery of their suffering written in ink, and that knowledge was more dangerous than any sword. By summer, The revolt had spread across Swabia, Franconia, and Thuringia. More than 10,000 peasants stood under arms. They appointed captains, formed councils, and swore oaths on the Bible itself that no man would be lord over another without justice. But unity was fragile. Not all leaders agreed. Some preached mercy, others vengeance. Munzer wanted a holy war, a cleansing fire. Hans Muller wanted survival, and while the peasants debated, the princes were gathering in distant halls. Knights donned armor polished like mirrors. Landsknecht's mercenaries, professional killers, were hired by the thousands. They laughed at the thought of facing farmers. But their commanders, veterans of Italian wars, knew better. Desperation, one said, makes men dangerous. The first confrontation came near Leipheim. The peasants, led by Muller, faced a column of armored cavalry. The peasants formed circles, wagons chained together, a wall of wood and faith. When the knights charged, expecting slaughter, the wall held. Arrows rattled off shields. Muskets cracked. The peasants fought back with flails and fire. And in a stunning moment, one that no historian can quite explain, the cavalry broke. The peasants cheered. They had done the impossible. They had made the mighty retreat. But what happened next? No one expected. The peasants began to believe they could win everything, not just freedom, but destiny itself. Villages rose up faster than messengers could count. Monasteries fell. Tithes were refused. Even some townsfolk joined, tired of taxes and lies. For a brief, blazing moment, the old world trembled, yet beneath the triumph, something darker stirred. Looting began. Old grudges surfaced. Men who once swore oaths of brotherhood took gold instead. The banners of faith turned into banners of vengeance. Munzer, burning with zeal, declared that God would soon deliver the final judgment through them. But his prophecy brought not unity, but fear. The peasants began to split, between those who sought justice and those who sought chaos. Still, they marched onward, and at the heart of every campfire, beneath every star, one question burned in every soul. Could they truly defeat the nobles? Could the lowest of men unseat the highest? The empire was watching and preparing its answer, for on the horizon, across the Danube, riders carried banners bearing the double-headed eagle. The princes were done waiting. They had gathered a new force, disciplined, ruthless, and led by commanders who had crushed rebellions before. But before the clash, something extraordinary happened. A group of nobles, secretly sympathetic, sent envoys to the peasants. They offered negotiation, the chance to meet, to talk peace. The peasants believed this was the moment God had promised. They agreed, and in the spring sunlight, under banners of truce, both sides met on an open field. But the nobles' words were honey over steel. As they spoke of peace, their armies moved from the hills behind the tents. The knights descended, fast, silent, unstoppable. The meeting was a trap. The peasants who came in faith were slaughtered where they stood. News of the betrayal spread like poison. Camps disbanded in panic. For every victory, the revolt now faced 10 defeats. And yet, even in that darkness, something burned on. In a small church in Thuringia, Munzer stood before his followers, his voice hoarse, his hands shaking. "Do not fear death," he said, "for God himself will strike down our enemies." They believed him. As dawn broke, thousands gathered once more, farmers with nothing left to lose. Their banners tattered, their blades rusted, but their spirit unbroken. And from the forests and mountains, word reached every surviving band. The final battle was coming, but fate had something else planned, because the next time the peasants met the knights on a misty field near Frankenhausen, history itself would bleed. And as the storm clouds gathered, one truth became clear. This was no longer a rebellion. It was a war for the soul of a nation. Voices of fire, the fires of revolt, had spread, but in every blaze a voice guided the flame. That voice belonged to Thomas Munzer. He was no ordinary preacher. Once a loyal servant of the church, he had stood beneath the cathedral's vaulted ceilings and felt the echo of hollow prayers. He had seen priests drink from golden chalices while children starved outside the walls. Somewhere in that silence, something in him broke, and from that fracture came fury. By the spring of 1525, Munzer's words had become more dangerous than any sword. His sermons weren't whispers of salvation. They were war cries wrapped in scripture. In Mühlhausen, where the revolt's pulse beat loudest, peasants gathered by the thousands to hear him speak. He stood atop a wagon, rain falling over his rough wool cloak, his voice slicing through thunder. "God's justice," he cried, "is not in the hands of princes. It is in yours." Every shout sent ripples through the crowd. Some wept, some lifted their tools like weapons, but all of them believed that heaven itself had chosen them to set the world right. But here's what few people realize. Munzer didn't want mere freedom. He wanted transformation. He saw the revolt not as rebellion, but revelation, the final purging of corruption before God's kingdom on earth, and that made him unstoppable and dangerous. While Munzer's fire spread across Thuringia, another man emerged from the south, a soldier turned leader, Florian Geyer. Unlike the preachers, Geyer understood war. He had fought for the nobles before turning against them, disgusted by their greed. His men called themselves the Black Company, an army of peasants dressed in looted armor. Moving like ghosts across the fields, they burned castles not for loot but for justice. Every wall that fell was a message. The old world is dying, but power has a way of dividing those who hold it. Between Munzer's divine fury and Geyer's military discipline, the movement began to split. One sought spiritual reckoning, the other strategic revolution. And while they argued, the princes prepared. By late spring, the Schwebenleague, a coalition of nobles and cities, was ready. Trained soldiers, mercenaries, artillery, everything the peasants lacked. Yet the nobles were wary. Their scouts brought back unbelievable reports: untrained farmers winning battles, fortified monasteries falling overnight, entire regions refusing to obey. The empire's balance was tilting, and for a terrifying moment, it seemed the peasants might actually succeed. Then came the gathering at Mühlhausen, the so-called peasant parliament. Thousands of rebels, muddy and exhausted, filled the square, shouting prayers, chants, and demands. Munzer stood before them, his eyes wild, his voice hoarse from days of preaching. "This is our covenant with God," he declared. "We will not yield until the unjust are swept from the earth." And the crowd roared, yet among them doubt crept in. Older men, scarred by war, whispered that too much faith could blind a man faster than fear. Hans Müller, now one of the revolt's commanders, felt the weight of that truth. He had seen enough blood to know that passion without discipline ends in ruin. But Munzer would not listen. "God will protect us," he said. And in those words lay the seed of disaster, because while Munzer's faith soared, the nobles' armies marched, swift, coordinated, merciless. From the south came Truxus von Waldburg, the peasant scourge. From the north, Duke George of Saxony. The noose was tightening, though the peasants did not yet see it. At Frankenhausen, Munzer gathered nearly 8,000 followers. The valley stretched before them, wide, green, and deadly. He promised them victory. He told them that God himself would send a rainbow in the sky as a sign of divine favor. And when dawn came, a rainbow did appear. The camp erupted in cheers, but what came next, no one could have foreseen. The princes advanced. Cavalry gleamed like a river of steel. Artillery rolled forward. Trumpets sounded from the hills. The peasants, drunk on faith, refused to flee. They formed their wagon fort, as they had before, believing God would strike their enemies down. For a heartbeat, silence ruled. Then, thunder, cannon fire tore through the wagons. Men screamed. Horses trampled the dying. Smoke choked the valley. Still, Munzer shouted from the rear, waving his banner, crying out, "Stand firm! The Lord will test your faith." But the Lord did not intervene. The peasants broke. The knights cut them down by the thousands. The field turned red. Those who ran were hunted. Those who surrendered were executed. When it ended, more than 5,000 lay dead in the mud. Munzer was captured, beaten, tortured, and finally executed, his head displayed on a pike as a warning to all who might dream of equality again, and yet, here's the cruel twist most never hear. Even after the slaughter, even as the empire silenced the last cries of rebellion, some of the nobles secretly admired the courage of those who rose. They fought, one wrote, as if the heavens themselves rode beside them. The revolt had failed, but its echo was eternal dot in the burned fields. In the ashes of ruined castles and the whispers of survivors, a single truth lingered that for the first time in centuries, the poor had dared to look their masters in the eye and say no, but the story is not over. For even in defeat, something survived, an idea that refused to die, and from that idea, a new war would rise, not of swords, but of words. The uprising, the smoke of Frankenhausen still hung in the air when the empire thought it was done. But the revolt, like a wounded beast, wasn't finished yet. Across the German countryside, the fires burned on dot in Swabia, Franconia, and Alsace. Word of Münster's death didn't kill the dream. It turned it into fury. Every man who had lost a brother at Frankenhausen now swore vengeance. Every woman who had seen her home burned whispered, "They will pay." The peasants who survived the first massacres didn't return to their fields. They regrouped. They learned. And from the ashes of blind faith a harder, colder resolve was born. Hans Müller, who had escaped the slaughter, gathered what men he could. His face, once calm, now carried the shadow of every village burned. He no longer spoke of divine justice, only survival. "If God won't save us," he said quietly, "then we'll save ourselves." And thus began the second wave. But this time, the revolt had teeth. The peasants built war camps along the rivers, barricaded towns, and captured supply routes. They seized the weapons of fallen knights, repaired them, and learned how to use them. For the first time, they began to resemble an army. The nobles called them the mob. But a mob doesn't march with banners or appoint officers or form councils of war. This one did. Still, their enemies were relentless. The Swabian League's forces, trained and disciplined, advanced in columns, armor glinting, cannon wagons rattling across muddy roads. They fought under banners bearing the imperial eagle, as if heaven itself sanctioned their slaughter, and yet, even the knights began to feel fear, because in the dark of night, when mist rolled over the valleys, they heard drums. The peasants' drums, the Black Company, Florian, Geyer's band had returned. They moved through the forest like specters, striking at isolated garrisons, cutting off supply lines, and burning manors before disappearing into the hills. The nobles called them demons in peasant clothes. Geyer called it retribution. For months, the empire bled. One night, in a ruined monastery, Geyer met with Müller. Candlelight flickered between them, shadows dancing on the cracked stone walls. "They say we fight a lost war," Müller said. Geyer smiled faintly. "Then let them lose it slowly." Their goal was no longer victory, it was vengeance measured in fire. But vengeance has a price. In one captured town, enraged peasants took revenge on the noble families. The killings were brutal, merciless. Geyer tried to stop them, but rage is a storm without rains. The nobles' cruelty had taught the peasants too well, and now that cruelty was reflected back upon them, and this was the moment. Everything began to shift. What had begun as a cry for justice was becoming a cycle of blood. The higher ideals of the 12 Articles, equality, fairness, freedom, were drowned beneath revenge. And the empire, watching from its cities, began to rally again. Reinforcements poured in. Princes who had quarreled for decades now stood united in fear. Even Martin Luther, the reformer whose words had inspired the people's courage, turned against them, condemning the revolt as the work of Satan himself. The peasants had lost not just allies, but the favor of God in the eyes of the powerful. Still, they fought on. In May of 1525 near Würzburg, Geyer's Black Company launched a daring assault on a castle fortress, one said to be impregnable. The nobles mocked them from the walls. But when dawn rose, the fortress was burning. How did they do it? A surviving soldier later wrote, "With fire, smoke, and fury, like men possessed." That victory sent shockwaves through the land. For one brief, brilliant moment, It looked as though the peasants might actually force the princes to the table, but that was when betrayal struck again. A council of noblemen, pretending to negotiate peace, sent word that they were ready to meet. Exhausted, starving, and desperate, Muller agreed. His men marched to the valley of Königshofen, only to find the enemy already waiting. The peace talks were another trap. The nobles unleashed their cavalry. The peasants, surrounded, fought back fiercely, but this time there was no miracle. Cannon tore through their ranks. Muskets shattered the air. When the smoke cleared, Muller himself lay wounded among the dead. The Black Company heard of it days later. Geo's rage was volcanic. He vowed to strike one last blow before the revolt died. In June, he led his men against the last bastion of noble control in Franconia. They stormed it at night, swords gleaming, shouting the same words Munzer had once preached. God wills it. But dawn brought not triumph, but silence. The nobles had tracked them. Surrounded, outnumbered, and cut off from retreat, Geir's men fought to the last. When his body was found, the chronicles say he had not run. His blade was still red, the Black Company was gone, and with it, the heart of the rebellion. But here's the part no one ever told you. The empire didn't celebrate, even as victory bells rang. Whispers spread among the nobles, whispers of guilt. Some had seen what their soldiers had done. Women hanged from trees, children orphaned, entire villages erased. This is not triumph, one knight wrote in his journal. It is the death of our own souls. The war had ended, but the conscience of Europe had been scarred forever. By summer's end, more than 100,000 peasants were dead. Entire regions were silent, only smoke rising from what had once been homes. The survivors returned to their fields, eyes hollow, their dreams buried with their dead, and yet, even in that silence, a seed remained. The peasants had lost the war, but they had changed the idea of justice. Their words, their 12 articles, survived. Copied, translated, hidden in monasteries and books, they would resurface again and again in the centuries to come. In them lay the foundation of something far greater, the idea that no man is born to serve another, but before that seed could grow, Europe would drown once more in fire, because as the last embers of revolt died, religion itself would fracture and a new war, born of faith and vengeance, would begin. The turning of the tide, the summer of 1525, should have brought peace. The fields were green again, the rivers calm, the skies clear. But beneath that calm, beneath the scent of wheat and smoke, lay ghosts. The revolt was dying, but not dead. Scattered bands of peasants still roamed the forests and valleys, hunted by noble patrols. Villages that had dared to defy their lords were turned to ash. The air itself seemed heavy with fear. But in that silence, among the survivors, stories began to spread, stories of vengeance, of faith betrayed, and of one last chance to strike back. In a tavern near Württemberg. Under flickering candlelight, 3 men met in secret. One had fought beside Hans Muller, another had escaped the massacre at Königshofen, and the third, a quiet preacher with weary eyes, carried a letter written in blood. It bore a single line: God's justice has not yet spoken. They decided it would speak again, but the empire was ready now. The princes, once divided by politics and pride, had found unity in fear. They saw the revolt not merely as rebellion, but contagion, a sickness that had to be cured by steel. And so they unleashed it. Columns of mercenaries marched across the countryside, moving like storms. Their orders were clear: no mercy. What followed was not war, it was erasure. Entire towns were surrounded and burned. The Schwebenleague cut down anyone suspected of aiding the rebels. Crops were destroyed. Livestock slaughtered. In some regions, famine followed faster than forgiveness. And yet, in that horror, something strange began to happen. Some knights, those who had once mocked the peasants, began to hesitate. They had seen too much blood, too many corpses hanging from trees. If this is God's will, one captain wrote, then heaven is silent. Even Martin Luther, who had denounced the revolt, began to waver. He had hoped his words would bring peace, but now they were being used as justification for slaughter. We have made beasts of men, he whispered, and they call it order. But the princes pressed on. In Franconia, They captured the remnants of a peasant battalion hiding in a forest. There were no trials, no mercy. They were executed on the spot, their bodies left as warnings. In Thuringia, the charred remains of villages were said to glow for days after. The people no longer dreamed of victory, only survival. Still, one last ember glowed in the ashes. A small band led by an old soldier named Georg Metz kept fighting, not for conquest, not even for justice, but for memory. They ambushed patrols, freed prisoners, and vanished into the night. To the peasants who hid in the hills, they became myth, ghosts of vengeance haunting the empire that had crushed them. The nobles called them bandits. The peasants called them saints, but even legends need food. And winter was coming. As the nose fell, Metz's men began to fade, captured, executed, or lost. The last record of them tells of a skirmish near the Rhine where a handful of starving rebels fought against 100 soldiers and refused to surrender. They were buried where they fell, unnamed, and yet that's not where the story ends, because the princes, in their triumph, had made a fatal mistake by silencing the peasants. They had amplified their message. The 12 Articles, once banned, once burned, began to reappear in pamphlets and sermons, secretly copied, passed between scholars and tradesmen. Their words whispered of rights, justice, and equality under God. They became the seed of future revolutions, ideas too, powerful to kill, but in 1525 those ideas were still dangerous. Anyone found preaching them risked death. In the cold ruins of Mulhausen, where Munzer had once preached, a single parchment survived the flames. It read, "The sword of justice may be broken, but the word of truth cannot be chained." It was signed only with a cross, and that cross, drawn by a dying hand, would outlive empires. But here's where history turns dark again. In victory, the nobles did not find peace. Their lands were scarred, their coffers empty, their peasants too broken to work. What they had restored with blood now bled them dry. The empire, though triumphant, began to rot from within, its faith divided, its conscience corroded. Whispers spread that the revolt had been a warning, a sign of divine judgment ignored. Plague and famine soon followed, as if the heavens themselves had turned away. The peasants' bodies fed the earth that year. And from that earth a new faith began to grow. Preachers in secret spoke not of rebellion, but of rebirth. They said that the martyrs of the fields would rise again, not in arms, but in spirit. That someday the world would remember their suffering and call it courage. And centuries later, that prophecy would prove true. But for now, the world of 1525 was a graveyard, silent, smoldering and changed forever, still. Among the ruins, a lone rider carried a message to the south. No one knew his name. No one ever found his body. But the letter he carried survived. It read, "The war is lost, but the truth has begun. We were farmers once, but we became fire. And fire does not die." As snow covered the charred fields, the last witnesses of the revolt disappeared into history, their faces forgotten, but their defiance immortal. And as the empire rebuilt its walls and wiped their names from the records, one thing could never be erased: the fear, because deep down the lords and princes knew the people had tasted power once, and one day they would taste it again. Ashes of the faithful. The year after the revolt ended, the land lay in ruin. Fields once golden with wheat were now graves. Smoke rose from charred villages, curling through the cold morning air like ghosts searching for names. The lords had won, but the empire was quieter than ever. Too quiet. In that silence, Europe seemed to hold its breath. The peasants were gone. The great revolt had been crushed with a brutality no one dared to write about openly. Yet beneath the fear, beneath the ashes, something remained, a whisper, an idea too stubborn to die. In the shattered town of Mulhausen, once the heart of Munzer's vision, the church bells no longer rang. Their ropes had been cut, their towers scorched, but deep beneath the ruins, a young monk named Lucas kept a hidden book, a battered parchment copy of the 12 Articles. Its ink was smeared with ash, its words faint, but the message still burned: no man should rule another without justice. Lucas read those words by candlelight every night. To him, they weren't rebellion. They were prophecy. And across the continent, others began to feel the same. Princes could kill men, but not memory. The survivors of the revolt carried that memory in silence. In every village rebuilt from ruins, in every prayer said for the dead, the old pain became something new, a lesson, carved into the soul of a generation. But here's the truth most never hear. It wasn't the nobles who rebuilt Germany after the revolt. It was the widows, the mothers, the children who learned to till burnt fields and pray over bones. These people who had lost everything became the foundation of a new Europe. While the princes celebrated victory, their peasants endured famine. While the church thanked God for order restored, the common folk whispered that perhaps God had turned away altogether. And then something remarkable began to happen. The same ideas that had burned with the peasants' banners, liberty, fairness, equality before God, began to echo in unexpected places, among scholars, reformers, and even merchants who saw that power without mercy led only to ruin. The revolt's blood had watered the roots of something vast and unseen, a moral awakening that would one day become the Reformation's shadow and later the seed of revolution itself. But in 1526, that future was only a dream. For now, there was only survival. Hans Muller's name was whispered among the peasants like that of a lost king. Some said he escaped to Switzerland. Others said he wandered the forests until he vanished. What is certain is this: songs were written about him. Songs that would survive long after every noble banner rotted away. They called him the plowman's general. One verse, recorded decades later, still carries his legacy. He fought for the hungry. He fell for the poor, and though he sleeps now, his cry shall endure. And what of Munzer, the man who preached the storm? The church called him the heretic. The princes called him the traitor. But among the people, he became something else entirely, a symbol of faith that dared to question the divine order itself. Even in death, his name terrified those in power because it reminded them that belief, once awakened, could never be fully chained. By the turn of the century, his ideas would return, not in swords and fires, but in words and reform. And the same scriptures that had once justified oppression would now be turned against those who wielded them. The peasants had died believing their cause was lost. They never knew that they had, in truth, begun something no army could stop. Still, history rarely honors the fallen poor. Their bones became part of the land, their names forgotten by the chronicles of kings. But in every peasant who later rose to demand a voice, in every rebellion, every call for rights, every tear shed for justice, their spirit returned. And centuries later, when revolution swept Europe again, when thrones trembled and the people once more took to the streets, scholars would trace the first heartbeat of that defiance back to one moment, the spring of 1524, when peasants with nothing but faith and fury faced an empire of steel. Even now, the lesson endures. The revolt was crushed. Yes, but not defeated, because the truest revolutions are not measured in battles won or lost, but in the ideas that refuse to die. Every empire eventually falls. Every tyrant fades. But every time a man stands and says, "Enough," he echoes the cry of those forgotten peasants, the farmers who faced nights, the mothers who buried sons, the preacher who saw heaven in the eyes of the poor. And so, as the ashes of the faithful settled into the soil of Germany, something eternal was born, a silent vow whispered across generations. We were the dirt beneath their boots, but we became the fire that will one day burn their crowns. The wind carried those words through ruined fields, over rivers, across centuries. And though the bells of Mulhausen no longer rang, if you listen closely, if you truly listen, you can still hear them tolling through time. For freedom, for faith, for the forgotten. And history was never the same again.